Hi, I'm Kath from Veg Patch Kitchen Cookery School, and today we're going to talk about how to start a sourdough starter. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do 3 different starters. So we've got wholemeal flour in this one, rye flour in this one, and we're going to put white flour into this one. Now you don't need 3 different starters, you only need 1. And it's up to you which flour you choose to refresh your starter or to make your starter with. Okay. If you want to make sourdough, you need to have a starter. It takes anywhere between 5 and 10 days to make a sourdough starter. Okay, so this is day 1. So in each of these jugs, I've got 25 grams of flour. And in this white jug, what I'm going to do is weigh it, and then I'm going to write on here the weight of the jug. So the jug weighs 58 grams, okay? So when I come to do my refreshes, I can just put that jug on the scales at 0 and then just take away 58 grams, which is the weight of the jug, and I know exactly how much starter I've got in that pot. So 0 off my scales now. And I'm going to add in 25 grams of white flour. Always use organic flour when you're making a sourdough starter. Okay, you might not refresh it with organic all of the time, although I recommend that you do, but certainly start it with organic. Organic wheat will not have had the fungicides, pesticides and herbicides that non-organic wheat will have had. And it's really in the interests of your sourdough starter that it doesn't have all of those chemicals on there. I have warm water here, and to each of these jugs I'm going to add 25 grams of water. So we will use the 25 grams of flour and water each day until we start to see some vigorous activity. That's going to be at least 5 days, possibly 10, depending on the temperature of your room, the flour you're using, and the general atmosphere that your starter is in. The white, you can see, quite a loose-ish sort of slurry of a starter, not too loose. You want it to have this sort of thickness. You could go a little bit thicker. Anything too loose and it will start to degrade much quicker, okay? It needs the flour to eat in there. And that's a wholemeal, similar thickness, and the rye much stiffer, okay? Can you see? So what I'm going to do with the rye is just add in a tablespoon. This water's now got lots of flour in it. Extra of water, just because I want it a bit looser than that to give it a chance to get going. I'm going to cover these well, leave them for 24 hours and show you tomorrow what they look like, and we will add another 25 grams of flour and water into there. So we're on day 2 of the starters. It's been 24 hours since I started these off. This is the wholemeal. There is a little bit of hoochie liquid on the top of there. It looks unpleasant. There's not any activity at all. So, you know, it's how you would expect some flour and water to look after being left on the side for 24 hours. Nothing going on yet, as to be expected. This is the rye. Very similar, nothing going on. There isn't as much hoochie liquid on the rye, but there's no activity. There's some little bubbling going on underneath, which will be the oxygen bubbles trapped in there from the vigorous stirring I gave it. And the white. Some bubbles on the surface. Again, nothing happening really in there, to be expected. Things are starting to get going, but nothing really is happening. You can see a few bubbles popping as I'm moving it around the bowl. So there's some air trapped in there and there is something starting to happen, but it won't be anything significant yet. So what we're going to do is refresh them in exactly the same way as we did yesterday. So adding 25 grams of flour to each one, along with 25 grams of water. So this will be left now for another 24 hours. I put another 5 grams into that rye because, as I showed you yesterday, rye absorbs more water than the other two. I mean, it looks like sort of cement sludge right now. But it's exactly what we would expect on day 2 of starting a new starter. So we're on day 3 of our starter now. So this is the rye. If I look, there's tiny little bubbles in there. Okay, so it's started to ferment. It smells sour, not particularly pleasant. You know, there's not what you're looking for in a sourdough starter is a pleasant, sweet acidity. This does not smell pleasant. It just smells off. Okay, it's not ready yet, so it doesn't have that lovely tang that sourdough starter does have. So we're on day 3. Now, when I first made sourdough starter several years ago now, I was following a book that said it'll be ready by day 4, and I followed that to the absolute letter, and I started to use my sourdough starter on day 4, and it was not ready. It was bubbly like this one, but it had that smell that wasn't right. And of course I had no idea about that, so I used it and was really disappointed in the loaf and thought sourdough's not for me, and I didn't pick up sourdough probably for another 6 months, a year, until I thought actually I'll try it again. So don't rely on how many days it takes, rely on your nose and your senses and whether or not this is rising. This hasn't done any rising in this jug. It's got a few bubbles in the bottom, but there's no rise in volume at all. And it doesn't smell pleasant. It smells, I don't know how to describe it, just not very nice. Okay, so that's the rye. There's visible bubbles on the top of the wholemeal. Bubbles underneath, very similar to the rye. Not much of a rise in volume. Doesn't smell as bad as the rye, but doesn't have the lovely sweet acidity of a sourdough starter yet. Okay, so we're still going with that one too. It is only day 3, so you would expect it to not be ready. I'm not sure if you can see the bubbles in the white. Let me just stir the spoon through it. And you may be able to see them. So there are more bubbles visible in the white. Oh, I really don't like the smell of a white starter when it's not ready. It always reminds me, and this is really unpleasant, so I'm sorry about this. It reminds me of newborn baby poo. It's got a really horrible smell to it. It's a sort of milky off smell. When it's not yet mature. Okay, so there's some fermentation going on in there, but it's certainly nowhere near being ready to raise a loaf. It is quite bubbly, but it needs longer. Okay, so I'm going to do exactly the same on day 3 as I've done for day 1 and day 2. I'm going to add 25 grams of each of the flours to each of the pots and 25 grams of water, and we're going to stir. So we're on day 4, there's bubbles going on, fermentation is happening, the smell is a little bit better than it was yesterday. It's getting towards the sweeter rather than the sour, unpleasant smell that was happening on day 3. So we're getting somewhere here with these sourdough starters now. We've got 75 grams of flour and 75 grams of water in total in each one, because we've put 25 grams of each over the past 3 days. So what we're going to do now is discard a lot of the starter, okay? Because what happens is we've only given it 25 grams yesterday in a 50 gram already flour. That was quite a weak refresh. And the bacteria and the yeast that are starting to ferment need plenty of food at this stage. If we don't give them plenty of food, what will happen is the acid load will build up and the acid will overtake the yeasts in the sourdough starter mixture. So you'll end up with something very acidic without the yeasts, wild yeasts. Well, they'll still be in there, but they'll be much weaker because the acidity will affect them. And so your loaf won't rise as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to discard at least sort of half of this. So the only place that this can go, this discard, is in the bin. Okay, it's not going to be pleasant for anything or can be used for anything. So I measured the jug before I started my starter so that I knew how much to take off. So in here, let's take the spoon out. I've got 120 grams, which means I've got 60 grams of starter in there. That'll be 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water. And I'm going to add twice the amount of flour. So I've got 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water in there, making 60 grams. So I'm going to add 60 grams of flour today and 60 grams of water, just to give it a really good boost. Okay, this is what it needs right now, is a really good feed with some lovely flour for it to feast on. Build up those yeasts, build up the good bacteria, and get it ready for making some loaves. It might be another couple of days before I actually make loaves with it, but at this stage it wants a good feed. It's 8 days since I started these sourdough starters, and I want to show you what they look like now. So the last time they had a refresh was yesterday at 2 p.m, so about 19-20 hours ago. Okay, and this is the white. You can see it has risen to this level here in the jug when it got to its height and has deflated down. Lots of bubbles on the top. Oh, that smells right now. And I wish we had smelly vision, because it just smells sweet and lovely rather than a sour off smell. This is the rye. Lots and lots of bubbles inside there. If you can see, it came up to here on the jug and has deflated back down. So it rose about twice its height and has deflated, is starting to deflate back down. Lots of bubbles in there, lots of bubbles on the surface. Let's have a little, can you see those bubbles inside there? So that's nice and active. And then the wholemeal, again, it's come up, it's doubled in volume, and there's lots of bubbles still in there, and it's on its way back down. So these now have been sitting on my side for 8 days. Lovely smell to them, they're ready to use, okay? And if I didn't want to use them, I would need to now do a refresh of them, okay? Because can you see how they're starting to deflate back down? And you don't want them sitting on the side without a daily refresh. The way to overcome having to refresh your starter daily is by putting it in the fridge. Once you've done a refresh, let it start to bubble away and start to become double in volume. Then pop it in the fridge and it can sit there happily for as long as it needs to until you need it again.